Welcome back to The Outright Effect, a podcast in which unique perspectives challenge us to be better versions of ourselves. We're two ambitious women who talk about how we like to stretch our creativity and work on self-growth to become better people. I'm Shelly.
And I'm Tempsy. And today we're going to take a little bit of a look back. This is the last episode in season 2. And we just wanted to kind of summarize what we got out of this season, how we feel about the change, going from just every other Sunday posting an episode to seasonal structure, and talk about some of our guests. What do you think, Shelly?
Sounds great. I love
All
a good
right.
recap.
Awesome. I have to tell you, I actually got a lot out of this season. We talked to quite a few coaches, and some of those episodes, and even some of the episodes where we interviewed business owners, I got so many great tidbits that I could actually apply to my life. So it was a really good season for me. I know it's not just for me, but
Yeah, I thought it was really cool that we got to talk to a variety of different coaches. That was not planned. Like, we didn't go into season 2 thinking like, let's find all of the coaches we possibly could and round them up and ask them to be a guest. It just kind of happened coincidentally or organically, if you will. And I just thought it was so interesting. I think it was very timely for me to have those conversations with those individuals. And it was also interesting to see that there are a lot of common themes that they, I guess, kind of agree on, or like overlapping concepts. Maybe not exactly the same, but like things that, when you listen back to them, you're kind of like, oh, yeah, no, like starting things has to do with imposter syndrome sometimes, just getting started, and also thinking about like, big changes, which is, what that all is about too, sometimes when you're starting something brand new. And so, looking at all of those things together, I mean, I thought that was really interesting because we talked to 3 different people who don't really like converse on a regular basis, right? But then they're
right.
kind of saying the same thing.
Yeah, but they all have different disciplines, right? Or focuses, areas that they focus in terms of their coaching. So let's go into that. We talked to Carol Cervan, and she primarily focuses on supporting emerging leaders, meaning that if somebody is asked by their employer to become a leader and they've never been a leader before, like managing a team or whatever the case might be, there are other ways to be a leader, but she helps those folks transition. And, you
Mhm.
know, she has a lot of experience with transitions. She's had a lot of leadership experience, but she loves to help people with this type of thing. And so that's kind of where Carol's focus is. And we talked to her about big change. We've talked to Carol before. This isn't the first season, 2 of 2 seasons. This isn't the first season that we've spoken to her, but we went into specific items this season regarding big change, whether that be professionally or physically, like moving to a whole new state or whatever that could mean. But she has a lot of insight on transitions. And one of the things that really resonated with me, while we're recording, we're really managing the pace and the tone, and making sure we get to all the questions and asking follow-up questions. So really like resonating with the responses of the guest isn't exactly always happening. And so at the time of editing, that's where I get to re-listen to all of the great tidbits and information that our guests provide. And when I was editing the episode with Carol Cervan, it really helped me have a lot more empathy with the transition that my husband's going through. He had 3 different transitions, right? We moved here, he left his great job that he had in Hawaii. He was now essentially a stay-at-home dad doing homeschooling for our son, which is a huge transition, and moving, from one state to another across the Pacific. And then he went from that to my son starting to go to school, and then him starting his own business. And the conversations that we had around professional change with Carol really helped me be more empathetic with my husband in what he was going through, because I started to get a little bit frustrated with certain aspects, like maybe one day he needed to just take a break from it all. So he kind of spent the day lounging around at home, and I'd be like, what are you doing? You're supposed to be working. Like, this isn't like lounge around time. But in reality, starting a business and working through that takes a toll, especially with the ups and downs that he was going through at the time. And I just didn't get it at first until I re-listened to that episode. And I really appreciate that about this process, what we're doing here. And I really hope that it ends up helping anybody else out there. Like, that's the whole goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I know a couple people also reached out to me to thank us for doing the episode around physical change, meaning like moving to a new state or a new country. I knew some people at the time who were thinking about doing that, and so they really appreciated that we took the time to talk to Carol about that and share that information on our free podcast, So, and I think you're right. Like, there are definitely through lines between what Carol talked about and what some of the other coaches talked about, because a lot of it is about transitions and mindset. And so that's what Carol focuses on. And then we talked to Heather Patterson, and she is a coach specifically focused around mindset. And so she talks to people who maybe are making transitions, or not necessarily just from not being a leader to becoming a leader, but other different types of transitions. And also folks who may be like kind of going through burnout or things of that nature, to help them through that season of their life, and specifically working on their mindset. So
Mm-hmm.
we talked to Heather about starting over and self-talk, and that was really interesting as well. And then Nicole, do you want to talk a little bit about Nicole and what she focuses on?
Sure, yeah. So Nicole Ralston focuses on, she calls herself a launch coach, and her focus is working with her clients to get started on whatever their project might be with their business. So it could be, launching a new product, or kind of starting a business from scratch, really, sometimes, right? And I
Yep.
think it varies depending on what her client is interested in. And she finds that a lot of common themes are related to imposter syndrome,
Right.
where we're questioning ourselves about like, but I'm not there yet. So do I call myself that yet? And I feel like a lot of us have that, perhaps, in the back of our minds. It's funny. I was actually watching something on YouTube the other day where it was kind of like a design challenge. And apparently there's these online modules you can do for fun. It's like a game. And so one of the people who was participating in this, they asked him, are you a designer? And he's like, I like to think that I am. But truly, I mean, if you think about it, like he kind of is. Like he's made
Right.
clothing before, and like he draws and all this kind of stuff. So one would probably see him and say like, that's a designer, but he was even kind of questioning it himself through, the things that he was saying. Would I
Yeah.
even call myself that? Like I want to call myself that. So I think that imposter syndrome is an interesting thing to explore. That's, to me, actually, I feel like sort of not a newer concept. Like I knew those things went on in people's minds and, in my mind as well. But the actual term is relatively newer to me, in the past few years, where I'm like, oh, they call it something. Okay, got it.
Right.
And so, yeah, we talked about that with Nicole a little bit, and it was really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. The imposter syndrome reminds me of our episode where we talked about work-life balance,
Hmm.
because I meant to tell you about this before we started recording, but it's still applicable because it was within the season. That term actually came up in the late 80s. Can you believe
Oh,
that?
that's
Yeah.
that's interesting. I mean, I can kind of see, because I think that nowadays people are trying to do, I mean, it's probably because of technology and communication and the internet, and we can all see what everyone else is doing
Yes.
these days, like it is more apparent and obvious to us that this stuff is going on. Imposter syndrome is happening to a lot of people out there. But I can definitely see how the term may be old, because it was likely floating around back then. It's just that there wasn't like a spotlight put on it where we could like see everybody going through it at the same time.
Right, right. Or
So
we were
yeah,
like
it's
early on
interesting.
in our careers, right? To where it wasn't necessary. Like if you're working, like you worked in a grocery store, right? It was like you didn't take your work home with you, really. You logged in at 8
Hmm.
or whatever your login times were, and you kind of left at a certain time, and you had specific hours that you worked every single week. And so you didn't really need to focus on work-life balance per se.
Hmm.
But the reason it came to be was because there was one point where women were not part of the workforce. And once
Oh
women
yeah.
got into the workforce, all of a sudden you had, somebody who was not caring for the home as much, as before. And that individual who used to, the woman, is now having to do both, be in the workforce and care for the home. And then it was like becoming too much, right? And so there's this concept that came up about, and at that time, companies were trying to push the limits as to what they could produce or put out there. And so they taxed their employees more. And so there was this big dynamic shift. And that's why I was like so interested. I thought this was really interesting when I read this, but I digress. Sorry to take us off topic.
You know what's funny though, and like we can keep this in the recording. When you started talking, because we just got off of imposter syndrome, I thought that's what you were talking about was the concept from the 80s
Oh no.
rather
Sorry,
than
work-life
work-life
balance.
balance.
Yeah. Work-life balance is from the late 80s, but imposter syndrome, I think it's, I mean, I don't know. I don't know when it came to be, but I think it's a little bit more of a more recent term, but yeah. So some other common themes that came out of this season was that, or at least with the coaches that we spoke to, in addition to like imposter syndrome, there are many other internal barriers that prevent us from moving forward and trying things out. And so, one of the things that was mentioned was just trying to work through those and don't let them get in your way. And just recently, we posted a quote on our Instagram about not over improving your weaknesses. And I think like a bigger picture type of thing to get out of that is to not let some of these bigger things or focusing on your weaknesses getting in the way of you moving forward, right?
Hmm.
Like just go, just get started, take it one bite at a time. Any big tasks, any big monumental things that are like overwhelming you, break them down into smaller pieces and just move forward. And so I thought that was a little bit timely, right? Like that we posted about that. And it was also for the new year because we're all making New Year's resolutions. But I think that kind of helps put into perspective some of these internal barriers, some doubts that we might have. And we just need to try to get started.
Yeah, totally. So some other episodes that we posted in this past season. We talked to entrepreneurs, women in business who we've seen out there for quite some time, and we finally got a chance to invite them on, like Jessica Twiggy. I actually purchased something from her a few years ago. I'm like, when did I get married again? But it was, at least 4 or 5 years ago that I purchased like a set of bridesmaids, like bags. That was something I think she was doing back then and maybe not anymore. I'm not quite sure because it's been a few years in between. But I remember seeing her at Made in Hawaii and other kind of like pop-up sort of events. And that's how
Mhm.
I learned about her brand initially. And back then I had also purchased a couple of other things from Twiggy as well. I've had this organizer for a really long time. It's so funny. I took a picture and I sent it to her and she's like, oh my gosh, that's like OG Twiggy, merchandise from like back in the day. And I was like, yes, that's as long as I remember, being interested in her products. And it's funny because after I made that purchase for my bridesmaids, I had run into her at one of those pop-up events and mentioned it to her, like, oh yeah, you just sent me a set of like bridesmaids bags, I ordered from you. And she remembered my name. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is crazy. Like, talk about customer service, like,
Yeah.
so yeah, it was great to sit down and talk with her about building her brand. I feel like her story is very relatable because she was someone who had a full-time job, a day job, and she transitioned from that into being full-time at Twiggy. And the amount of, dedication, time, in her words, blood, sweat, and tears that she put into it to start that, I thought was, really a really great story to share, and wanting to push through to show her son that if you put your mind and efforts into something, you can get it to go somewhere.
Yeah. Another thing I also really appreciated about her episode was the support she received from her dad. Not only the support, but like the guidance almost. Like, it's okay to be an entrepreneur. In fact, I want you to think about that as a possibility for yourself. And here's,
Hmm.
just modeling that for your child, but also getting them involved. Wow, that was huge. And I hope to do that for my kid.
Right. And starting off so young, like, hey, call it Jessica's whatever XYZ company, right? Like when you're
Yeah.
little and you're just doing something for fun. Like, I think that's really cool. I think a lot of us probably grew up playing teacher or whatever, you know what I mean? Where it's like
Yeah.
this preset role that we already are kind of familiar with. And then, really going outside of the box and playing in another kind of way, thinking you're an entrepreneur as you're like acting out this like scenario, right? I think that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we had Emily from Ure on. And I think for both of these guests, Jessica and Emily, I was so pleasantly not surprised, but it was just such pleasant conversations with really, truly genuine people, like genuinely kind people who were super open to sharing a lot about their businesses. And I can't tell you how grateful I am for those experiences and speaking to these it's just so inspirational to me. But with Emily at Ure, she talked about limiting beliefs as well, right? And how she had worked so hard to empower other women, but then had to remind herself that she too was also worthy of anything she wanted to do. And it took a lot of mindset work for her, gratitude practice, and remembering to come back to her internal belief systems to ensure she wasn't also limiting herself. And I can relate to this. I there are people who come to me for advice, or if like I'm leading a team of people, it can be so easy to share inspiring information or information to empower them and then forgetting to think about yourself, right? And I think a lot of people talk about this. I can't remember who I spoke to about it, but there's like this internal dialogue of like this mean girl who's telling you you're not worthy and things like that. But if it was a friend of yours who was saying that to you, you would try to comfort them, you would try to help them and tell them, don't even worry about it, or oh my gosh, you got this. But then you forget to tell yourself that, and you're
Mhm.
always your worst critic, right? And so I just thought this was such a great reminder of remembering to be compassionate with yourself and to empower yourself just as much as you empower those around you.
Yeah, and I think something that's so cool about Emily's story, and I don't know, I feel like I seek out stories like this, but her motivation and inspiration to starting her brand came from travel. Like she took the
Yeah.
time to go around and see the sights and like do a bunch of adventurous things, right? Like she went to different countries and different places and getting like feeling like you want to do something like from
Right.
that, I think is really cool. I just really enjoy hearing a story like that because sometimes I feel like when I hear those stories online in a YouTube video or whatever the case might be, I don't know who that is. And so I feel like, wow, this must have just been a really lucky person that had like money to travel or, whatever, like, it could be somebody like super famous now who's like telling this story and we're like, of course you have no problems doing this. But, hearing someone that's a little bit more like on your level telling that story of like that's where their inspiration came from, I feel like hits a little bit different because
Yeah.
it is more like relatable rather than, if I don't know, some billionaire
And
was
well,
telling
it
me that
helps it
story, right?
feel, yeah, but it helps it feel like it's a little bit more within reach than wanting to
Achievable,
prove.
right?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. Very interesting.
Hmm.
Well, we also spoke to Miss Shelly about reaching 1,000 subscribers on her YouTube channel. That was exciting.
Hmm. Yeah, and hopefully it'll just continue to grow. I'm definitely, planning to spend more time on doing anything related to YouTube videos and social media and stuff like that. So, yeah, looking
And you
forward to
just
what
recently
will come
did,
to the year.
yeah, and you just recently did Vlogmas, right?
We did Vlogmas, talked about a variety of different like semi-random topics, including like gift guides and things like that. But yeah, I have a lot of, I think, interesting things coming up for this year. There have been some requested videos that it just took me some time to record because it's more question products that I have to purchase and test out for a little while. So I was finally able to do that. And so yeah, some requested videos coming soon this year.
Awesome. Can't wait. Well, we also had episodes around personality assessments, which was really interesting for us. Shelly and I go in depth about our own personality assessment results on two different personality tests. And we also talked about a blog that is called Ask a Manager. And there's a bunch of HR questions that come in. And we just picked a couple and answered them from our own perspectives and from our own experience. And that was really fun to do. It's a new thing. We've never done that before. So I thought that was interesting. So
Mhm.
overall, Shelly, what do you think about the new structure, the seasonal structure?
Yeah, I really like the new seasonal structure. I remember suggesting that we go to a season format to give us some time in between. I think in season one is pretty lengthy, right? It's like 40 something episodes because we were just cranking everything out every other week. And sometimes we didn't have the time to, as much time as we would have liked to think through ideas and like what kind of format we wanted to talk through different things, especially when it comes to, for example, like taking a Myers-Briggs type, assessment. That
Mhm.
takes some time to like kind of go through and do that. And when you're cranking out episodes every 2 weeks, sometimes you don't necessarily have as much time to do that as you would like to. So I think that having a break between the first and second season was super helpful. We got to work on some other things, prepare things for ourselves to help us move forward. And we've started to do that a little bit lately, as well as we are moving into our break coming up right here.
Yeah. And it also provided more flexibility in terms of booking guests, right?
Hmm.
It not only gave us flexibility in terms of navigating how to schedule those types of things and prepare ahead of time, but also allowed the guests a little bit more wiggle room instead of just like, well, we got to launch this in 2 weeks. So I hope you have
Yeah,
some
are you free
time.
tomorrow? Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it definitely helped us space things out and take time to work on some other things here and there because we weren't as pressed to put something out. And I think at the end of the day, we're more comfortable with putting out a thoughtful product than to rush. It's like
Yeah.
quality over like versus quantity. And I think it just depends, like, depending on when anyone is doing out there, which one takes priority. But for us, it definitely is quality, and we want to make sure we have the time to do that.
Yeah, and as a reminder, we both have full-time jobs. So
Hmm.
we do this in our spare time to bring quality content to you folks, and we want to just make it as good as we possibly can given the time that we have.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, we just had such a great time this season, and we thank all of you so much for listening. We really appreciate it. We look forward to a new season coming in a few months. We'll definitely let you know when that's happening. But at this point, thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Outright Effect. You can find us at theoutrighteffect.com. Follow us on our social media accounts on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, all at The Outright Effect. You can also reach out by emailing us at theoutrighteffect@gmail.com. See you guys next time. Bye.
Bye.